A new and dramatic approach to regulating big technology firms has come into force across the European Union and likely is affecting organizations in many other jurisdictions as well. The Digital Services Act, which the European Council signed into law in September 2022, aims to protect the digital space against the spread of illegal content, particularly on social networks, content-sharing platforms, and e-commerce sites. But frankly, that quick rundown only scratches the surface for how this regulation is going to impact technology organizations around the world. This is Kevin Donahue, Senior Director with Protiviti, welcoming you to a new edition of Powerful Insights. I recently sat down with Protiviti Managing Director Kaitlin Kirkham-Cooper and Protiviti Associate Director Roxanne Miller to talk about the ins and outs of this new regulation and, most importantly, how technology organizations need to go about setting up their compliance processes for it. Both Kaitlin and Roxanne are with the Risk and Compliance practice of Protiviti. Kaitlin leads the Risk and Compliance Technology sector within this group. She consults with large organizations in managing all types of regulatory and operational risk with a focus on compliance programs. Roxanne works with technology and financial services organizations on compliance and operational risk management. She has experience in both the United States and Asia Pacific regions with remediation and project management of complex regulatory issues, complex program build and scale, compliance risk assessment, issue management, and internal audit. Kaitlin, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Roxanne, it is great to speak with you. Thanks for joining us.
Of course. Glad to be here.
So, Roxanne, my first question is for you. Understanding the Digital Services Act is a fairly new requirement for technology companies. And it's probably safe to say many of our listeners may not have heard about it. Given that, can you provide us with a bit of a 1,000-foot view of what this is and the companies to which it applies?
Yeah, of course. The DSA is a piece of EU regulation, and it's aimed at technology companies, like you said, specifically around understanding and moderating online content on their platforms. So the DSA is applicable to any companies with users in the EU, and obligations within the DSA are applicable to different definitions and tiers of these companies. The largest companies are known as very large online platforms and very large online search engines, and these are companies with 45 million users per month in the EU. So the most stringent obligations in the regulation apply to these. But even if an online platform or online search engine doesn't have 45 million users, there are still obligations that apply to it, as well as hosting service providers. So these could be companies offering cloud computing and intermediary service providers. And this could be like an internet access provider. And then in terms of timeline, the very large online search engines and very large online platforms had to comply back in August 2023, so a few months ago. And then the rest of the companies have to comply by February 2024. So they still have a few months before they have to comply, but that is coming up quickly.
Roxanne, a follow-up question here, just I guess for my own knowledge. This was something that emanated from or was passed by the European Union?
It was passed by the European Commission, aimed at companies with users in the European Union.
Okay, and so this is something that comes up with other regulations, so I'm going to ask. Just because it's out of Europe doesn't mean it doesn't affect companies all over the world, including the United States. In fact, I would imagine it's affecting most technology companies, certainly those that meet the profile you just described.
Exactly. If you are a company and you have a user in the European Union, then this impacts you. So it's super important to large global technology companies with users in the EU. So it applies to pretty much all companies in the world, most likely if they fit the definition, as long as they have users in the EU. It doesn't matter that it's from the European Commission. So super important to everyone.
We also think, too, just to add in there, I think there's, if you think about it like GDPR, right, and that GDPR really set the precedent for how European user data is managed and overseen. It's very similar, right, where European users are being protected in a way, but obviously these global companies, so companies like Meta, if you look at the VLOP and VLOSE list that Roxanne just rattled off, a lot of the companies on that list are some of the world's largest organizations. So it's the Metas of the world, it's the Amazons of the world, Pinterest is on there, Snap, right? It's a lot of these really large companies that we all work with and sort of use every day.
That's great color and great insight. Thank you both. So, Roxanne, you mentioned that there are different tiers of companies the requirements apply to. With the VLOPs needing to be in compliance by, I guess, this past August 25th, can you talk about how we are seeing those solutions, come to life, as it were? For instance, are there any outward or public things that I, as a consumer or other users, may notice?
Yeah, probably the biggest thing that users will notice is versions of products without recommender systems. So to be more specific, Meta is now giving EU users the option to view content without an algorithm. So it means it's not ranked by Meta using specific recommendations. So really specifically, users will have the option to take a look at content on Instagram, and that content is just going to be ranked in chronological order from newest to oldest. So back how it used to be, I guess. And then for users that are still choosing to use versions of those products with the recommender systems, they'll probably notice a little bit more transparency around why they're seeing certain content. So some products may have already had this option, but users should be able to click a button that says something like, why am I seeing this? And then they can understand why certain content was pushed to them, whether it's age, gender, location, who they followed, or any other pieces of metadata.
And Roxanne, a follow-up question to that. As a social media user, I'm wondering, how easy is it to find these settings? Are they required to put them up front, or does that matter where they're put?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think one thing this regulation will do is probably make these settings a lot easier to find. So I think the regulation uses terms like prominent, location. So a big decision that these companies will have to make is where exactly do they put these types of settings? And most likely they're going to need to be in an area on their product where users can see them easily, and they're not going to be buried in some sort of setting. They should be pretty prominent.
I think one of the things we have found interesting too, to piggyback off of that, Rox, is I know when we've talked to companies about the challenges of implementing these recommender system solutions, if you can imagine, a lot of these big tech companies, big social media companies, their livelihood is their recommender system, right? It's how they push content. It's how they generate better, more relevant ads for their users, which is how they make their money. So I think internally, while the recommender system requirements in and themselves aren't that complex, like what Roxanne just said, they are making sure that you're disclosing how your recommender system works, as well as making sure that there's an option, particularly for the VLOPs and the VLOSEs, that they have to provide a generic recommender system. Again, in and themselves aren't really that complex, but I think what we're seeing is there's kind of this conflict internally between compliance and products teams trying to solve for that. Compliance is saying we need to do what DSA is requiring us, which is making sure that there's a prominent option for having a generic solution. And I think the product teams have kind of combated that, because I think they're very proud of, obviously, the recommender systems they've built. And on top of that, they think the recommender systems they've developed are really giving the user the best experience.
That is really interesting. Thank you both. And I think, Kaitlin, this segues into my next question for you. And there might be other ones too, but what are some of the more complex requirements you see that are causing companies to struggle? I would imagine part of it is maybe the tug of war between compliance and the product developers and such. But I guess second part, how are those companies thinking about solutioning through these challenges?
Yeah, for sure. No, good question. I think maybe just even to back up before we get into the specific examples, I think we're finding a lot of the work and complexity in solving for DSA is dependent on how well these large tech companies already have established what we would call like core compliance program elements. So for instance, companies that have had strong data mapping, database management, and having those things well documented have tended to mobilize much faster on implementing DSA controls. They've sort of had a base to work with. I think we're also seeing companies that have historically been subject to heavy litigation or enforcement from even American regulators, right? Like the DOJ and FTC have tended to have a leg up in building their programs. We think this is because these companies have had to build the muscle memory around making their controls auditable, because they've been under sort of enforcement and or litigation from sort of a higher being. They've also tend to have a stronger culture of compliance beyond just legal and compliance. And they've also had a framework for how to document their controls, how to test those controls, and how to actually resolve any issues stemming from that testing or review of controls. Again, that being said, we just talked about, so those are the types of companies we feel are kind of better, have been better set up, at least initially, to start implementing DSA requirements. We just talked a bit about the recommender systems, which I think, to Roxanne's point, is one that's been a major focus and probably has one of the biggest user impacts. I think another interesting one is what's listed in Article 34 of the DSA, which is the requirement specific to the VLOPs and VLOSEs, and it requires them to conduct a risk assessment. So the concept of a risk assessment in and itself isn't a new thing. These companies had to first produce their risk assessment on August 25th, like Roxanne said, but they're not necessarily visible to us yet. So we can't, the public, so we can't necessarily see what the output has been. I think different from risk assessments that have been performed by these companies in the past, meaning like operational risk assessments or security and privacy risk assessments, the risk assessment outlined under DSA contemplates really big, systemic, pretty undefined risks. So for instance, it requires platforms to be able to measure how harmful their company may be on fundamental human rights, or how harmful their platform may be in promoting the spreading of gender-based violence or misinformation. So again, really big systemic risks that I think have historically not really been quantified. So you can imagine there's a ton of subjectivity in how to measure the inherent risk of something that big, what data to use, how it actually applies. So I think that's another pretty complex one that we're seeing.
And Kaitlin, you mentioned these requirements that apply to the VLOPs and the VLOSEs. If a company, someone in our audience, is not a VLOP or VLOSE, but they work for a cloud service provider, maybe as a third party or fourth party vendor, something like that, or they're providing another intermediary service, what should they be doing now?
Yeah, great question. I think obviously the VLOPs and VLOSEs are kind of on an expedited timeline, right? They're 6 months ahead of everyone else. So first and foremost, I think we'd recommend just staying on top of what those companies are doing. There's a lot of publicly facing and available information and stuff really that competitors can use in trying to get information that companies like Google are actually publicly putting out in terms of their DSA compliance and stance. So again, the transparency reporting that those companies produce is a really good way to sort of benchmark and measure how the VLOPs and VLOSEs are actually bringing into fruition those requirements. So I think we'd recommend first and foremost, just like keeping a pulse on what those big guys are doing. But beyond that, I think there's really sort of a handful of steps that we think are important and valuable. Maybe the obvious one is first and foremost, just trying to figure out what articles actually apply to you as an organization. Like we outlined, there's different tiers of companies that are sort of subject to the regulation and therefore different requirements based on what type of company you are. And it's not super cut and dry in terms of how the articles actually apply to your firm. So what we had seen as common and what we would recommend is if you're a compliance professional or a risk professional, working with your legal team to make sure that you understand how the requirements actually apply to your organization. I think secondly, once you figure that out, we've really seen the companies and organizations do the best are the ones that actually assign ownership from a DSA perspective, kind of trying to pinpoint and highlight that one person who's actually going to own and drive DSA compliance, understanding that that person or role will likely require support from many functions within the organization. We don't think and wouldn't suggest that DSA compliance is centralized to sort of one person, meaning like that's their hard and fast, they have to do everything. They actually have to comply with everything. But what we've seen as successful is that person actually owns the compliance efforts and is able to sort of put their arms into all of the different product and engineering, sales and marketing teams to make sure that they have a view of what compliance looks like. And then I think finally, what we would suggest is really just doing a high level gap analysis against those obligations that apply to you and trying to figure out what is your current state of compliance. So very simply, what are the obligations that apply to you? What are the expected controls? And is your company doing anything today that could be considered a control activity against those obligations? So this should produce kind of a high level enough understanding of where you have gaps in your program. and what maybe needs funding or remediation. And obviously, like Roxanne said at sort of the start of this, February 2024 is the compliance date for everyone else, for all other companies that aren't VLOPs or VLOSEs. So we'd recommend that those remediation plans be developed and sort of actioned through the lens of February 2024 being the end date.
The other thing I would add to that too is for any company that's not a VLOP or a VLOSE, it's super important to understand your monthly average number of users. Because should you kind of hit the 45 million mark or go over it, then that means you're kind of upgraded to be a VLOP or a VLOSE, which means a ton more obligations apply to you. So if you're underneath that number, it's important to have a methodology to understand what your number of users are per month, track that, and make sure that you understand if you're trending towards that to give yourself a really good runway to make sure that you're compliant with those obligations before you're over 45 million users. And then similarly, same with the types of products or services you offer. So if you're a company that's maybe considered kind of a lower tier, not yet an online platform, like you're an intermediary service provider, it's important to understand if you introduce a new product or service, does that mean you're now in a different tier and more obligations apply to you?
What I'm hearing as a bit of a layperson in this topic is it sounds similar to ESG compliance that we've been talking a lot about this year. And even like in the United States, SOX compliance, where you may not need to comply today, but you better know your roadmap because you may have to comply soon, either as a company that hits that threshold or you working for another company that it does need to comply with these requirements and then is going to require you to comply with them as their partner. Do I have that right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think the SOX analogy is one we've kind of thought about as well. Obviously, Protiviti kind of got our start and felt a lot of the benefit of the Sarbanes-Oxley sort of movement in the early 2000s. And I think we're seeing similar trends by way of everything you just said, Kevin. And I think what Roxanne and I are seeing are those companies that are on the cusp are using their position as a non-VLOP almost in a really strategic way. We're knowing that they want to grow. They have growth projections themselves, which assume a certain amount of European users in the future. I think we're seeing them look at what those requirements are and are starting to prepare early so that next year when they actually have to do a risk assessment, which they don't this year, but they will next year, they're able to have more of a systemic approach to doing it. They've got all of the right inputs. They can even leverage what they're seeing their competitors do by attending different industry forums and things like that to make sure that they've got a leg up and are ready to go once those requirements actually apply to them.
Great. And I guess another magic question that begs to be asked, what happens if companies fail to comply with these requirements? What are the prescribed penalties? And I guess beyond that, what are some other penalties they should be aware of?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say the European Commission came out pretty hot in writing sort of the fines for this one. So the DSA itself imposes really steep penalties for noncompliance. The maximum penalty for failure to comply is 6% of the provider's global annual revenue. So again, it's a European regulation, but the actual sort of penalty applies to global revenues. Just putting that into context, Instagram alone made $50 billion last fiscal year, which again, using the 6% application would impose a fine of $3 billion if they were found for the maximum penalty. Again, to put that into context, the largest historic fine for tech platforms in Europe was 1.3 billion. So it's over double that. All of that being said, I think there's still a ton of ambiguity around how the actual enforcement regime is going to work. So there's something called digital service coordinators, which are appointed by European country. I think it's still pretty unclear how exactly those coordinators will work. And similarly, I think we maybe hit on this a bit before, but the VLOPs and the VLOSEs actually have an obligation to be independently audited. So again, kind of similar to Sarbanes-Oxley, again, they have to bring in an independent audit firm to come in and really evaluate whether they are meeting the DSA obligations. So similarly, it's pretty unclear how much reliance is going to be placed on those independent audits by the digital services coordinators or the European Commission in general.
A follow-up question on that. Are you aware of any kind of similar sort of regulations or requirements being considered in the United States or other jurisdictions?
Yeah, so I would say there is more activity globally for content moderation regulations than in the US. Interestingly enough, because the US has this thing called freedom of speech, I think in the past it's been really hard to get traction on anything around content moderation and regulation. There's something called Section 230, which was passed in the early days of the internet and essentially provides protection over internet providers and a lot of these large tech companies. It basically limits their liability in terms of what they're liable for what's on their platform. I don't see there being a ton of movement from a US perspective in terms of there being a similar DSA type regulation, just given sort of the noise around that regulation and sort of the bipartisan disagreement in terms of that regulation. So I don't think we're expecting there to be any movement from the US specifically, but globally, there's definitely other countries that have similar content moderation regulations that are coming through the pike.
Interesting. And as we close out our discussion, and again, thank you both for joining me and sharing your insights here. Any other broader regulatory trends you see kind of emerging or affecting the landscape in the near or long term?
Yeah, totally. I mean, hopefully sort of the conversation today really points to how big the Digital Services Act is and how different it is from the existing regulation these tech companies are facing. I think it's only one of several that are coming out of Europe. So the Digital Markets Act is sort of what we would call like its sister regulation. They actually started off together, and then the commission decided to split the two since it was so massive. But the Digital Markets Act is aimed at really providing a more competitive and fair marketplace. So a lot of the obligations there are centered all around, antitrust and anti-competition, et cetera. The Digital Operational Resiliency Act, or DORA, while primarily a financial services regulation, it extends to critical information and communication technologies, or ICT providers, that essentially provide support to the financial services industry with an aim to ensure that there's operational resiliency activities and controls. So if you think about a lot of the like really large cloud service providers like the AWSs of the world, DORA would absolutely apply to them. I'm sure our listeners have heard and are aware of the AI Act, which is another huge regulation coming out of Europe. And it'll start to regulate something that has really never been regulated before and is quite fundamental to a lot of these tech companies' livelihood and really product. So these aren't even a full comprehensive list of the regulations coming down the pipe. It's pretty obvious that tech companies are seeing a similar trend in regulation as financial services did, for the past 30 or 40 years. And I think legal and compliance at these tech companies are already overwhelmed with these heightened standards and increased requirements that their organizations are going to have to adhere to, and it's only going to get worse. So I think what we've seen and what we recommend is managing these obligations one by one is sort of, death by 1,000 cuts. The time and money required to implement these requirements can't sustain the approach of trying to comply one by one. So we recommend that tech companies start to build their compliance strategy and compliance programs. So these incoming obligations are connected to sort of a centralized risk taxonomy, and it'll allow and enable leaders to strategically ensure that the right investments are being made to actually optimize compliance.
And then Roxanne, any final thoughts from you on these insights, topics, and such?
I think Kaitlin hit on it. I would just emphasize that the pace of regulation for the technology industry is quickening. And so it's super important for companies to start to build their compliance programs and figure out their strategies on how to comply with all these regulations now versus waiting to deal with them once they have to comply. And it's too late and a little harder to try to catch up.
And Kaitlin, you referenced the AI Act in the European Union. And of course, in the United States, there's just been an executive order issued around the use and development of artificial intelligence that, while not legally binding, certainly puts a regulatory lens on AI going forward, at least in the long term, that I would imagine companies need to be mindful of.
Totally. Yep. Absolutely.
My thanks to Kaitlin and Roxanne for joining me to talk about the Digital Services Act and its impact on technology organizations. I have one takeaway from this discussion. This is going to be huge for technology organizations that are going to need to take the right approach, adopt the right discipline, and adopt the right mindset in getting it done in the right way. This is going to be both a short and long-term challenge for them, and it's going to affect a lot of organizations, not just those in the VLOP and VLOSE groups. For more information, I encourage you to go to the Protiviti website and read our white paper, The Global Consequences of Europe's New Digital Regulatory Regime. You can also go to our risk and compliance page on the site and find more information about Protiviti's solutions and services in this area, as well as other thought leadership we're offering on these and related topics. And finally, I encourage you to please subscribe to our Powerful Insights podcast series and review us wherever you get your podcast content.